Hey everybody, welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie Reread. My name is Bina007 and I'm here for a minipod. It's episode 53. We are covering The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, originally published in November 62. This comes after Pale Horse and before The Clocks. And the first thing to note about this is that the novel is dedicated to Margaret Rutherford, who was playing Miss Marple in a series of films at this time. And I'm kind of surprised Agatha Christie dedicated the book to her because I thought she didn't like those films. And that's your first clue that this is another Miss Marple mystery. It's a rather wonderful one for social colour, for character, but maybe not so much for plotting. The plot introduction is that Miss Marple falls while walking in St Mary Mead. She's helped by a local lady called Heather Badcock, who brings her into her own home on the new development in St Mary Mead. Over tea, Heather tells Miss Marple how she once met the famous American actress Marina Gregg, who one can only assume is loosely based on Elizabeth Taylor. Marina Gregg, as it happens, has recently bought Gossington Hall from Miss Marple's old friend Dolly Bantry, who you will all know from The Body in the Library. When Marina Gregg throws a summer fete for all the locals, Heather is poisoned, drinking a daiquiri made originally for Marina Gregg. And so Miss Marple, stuck inside at home, is left to ferret out the clues thanks to all the differing accounts brought to her by her friends in the village. The title of the novel, The Mirror Cracked, comes from a poet by Alfred Lord Tennyson, a favourite of Agatha Christie's, and it comes from The Lady of Shalott, which many of us who went to English schools will have been forced to learn as children. And the relevant stanza is, "Out flew the web and floated wide, the mirror cracked from side to side. The curses come upon me," cried the Lady of Shalott. The Lady of Shalott, of course, being incredibly beautiful, so befitting a Hollywood actress. Before we get into the characters and the plot, and of course, after the end credits music, the solution and the clues, let's do a little bit of social change, because actually I think that is the real strength of this novel. If you want to read this novel, I think you do so principally to see in 1962 what Agatha Christie thought of all the change that was coming to British society on the cusp of the swinging 60s, going through something of an economic boom and seeing a post-war resurgence in housing development. So this is a novel filled with teddy boys and perms and cablegrams and slimming diets, all terms we haven't really heard before in Agatha Christie. And Gardener Laycock is doing the gardens of the new development. This is how Agatha Christie describes it. One had to face the fact St Mary Mead was not the place it had been. In a sense, of course, nothing was what it had been. You could blame the war, both the wars, or the younger generation, or women going out to work, or the atom bomb, or just the government. But what one really meant was the simple fact that one was growing old. Miss Marple, who was a very sensible lady, knew that quite well. It was just that, in a queer way, she felt it more in St Mary Mead because it had been her home for so long. End quote. And I think that's the attitude Agatha Christie / Miss Marple take in this novel, which is change comes, and you can't grouse about it too much. It just shows you're getting old, and you can't blame the young for wanting to live differently. It's a very pragmatic and rather modern attitude. I do find it funny, however, that there's lots of commentary on what it means to be a housewife. And now with women going out to work, the fact that they're not cooking their husbands proper meals. Miss Marple is frightfully conservative. She thinks men need proper homemade meals. Anyway, this is another social change. It's the move from the local greengrocer to the supermarket, another term we haven't heard in Agatha Christie before. Quote, Barnes the grocer was still there, unchanged, for which Miss Hartnell and Miss Marple and others daily thanked heaven. So obliging, comfortable chairs to sit in by the counter, and cosy discussions as to cuts of bacon and varieties of cheese. At the end of the street, however, where Mr. Tom's had once had his basket shop, stood a glittering new supermarket, anathema to the elderly ladies in St Mary Mead. Packets of things one never heard of, exclaimed Miss Hartnell. All these great packets of breakfast cereal instead of cooking a child a proper breakfast of bacon and eggs. And you're expected to take a basket yourself and go round looking for things. It takes a quarter of an hour sometimes to find all one wants, and usually made up in inconvenient sizes, too much or too little, and then a long queue waiting to pay as you go out. Most tiring. End quote. I do find that quite funny, the idea that you mean you can't just sit in a chair and wait for someone to bring you all your groceries? But there is, I think, something to food waste in a society where we have to buy everything by certain pre-measured quantities. The other thing that's coming to St Mary Mead is consumer credit and the concept of hire purchase, where you pay sort of small amounts towards a big item and then sort of eventually you've bought it outright. A little bit how you pay a mortgage and then own your house, but for ordinary consumer durables. Here's a quote. It was like Cherry Baker, who always called Miss Marple's old world, overcrowded drawing room the lounge. Miss Marple corrected her gently. It's the drawing room, Cherry. And Cherry, because she was young and kind, endeavoured to remember, though it was obvious to her drawing room was a very funny word to use, and lounge came slipping out. She had of late, however, compromised on living room. Miss Marple liked Cherry very much. Her name was Mrs. Baker, and she came from the development. She was one of the detachment of young wives who shopped at the supermarket and wheeled prams about the quiet streets of St Mary Mead. They were all smart and well turned out. Their hair was crisp and curled. They laughed and talked and called to one another. They were like a happy flock of birds. Owing to the insidious snares of hire purchase, however, they were always in need of ready money, though their husbands all earned good wages. End quote. So that's how Cherry ends up working for Miss Marple. And I think speaks to the rise of consumer credit and housewives buying the latest gadgets on tick, as we used to say in England. And so, yes, we have now heard mentioned of the development with a capital D and big new housing estate on the edge of St Mary Mead, which Miss Marple goes to explore because nothing's going to hold her back, even an officious new maid. She had a happy feeling of adventure. She turned to the right, entered the vicarage gate, took the path through the vicarage garden, and came out on the right of way. Where the stile had been, there was now an iron swing gate giving onto a tarred asphalt path. This led to a neat little bridge over the stream, and on the other side of the stream, where once there had been meadows with cows, there was the development. End quote. And this is how Miss Marple finds the people there. This is one of my favourite quotations in the entire book. The people, too, looked unreal. The trousered young women, the rather sinister looking young men and boys, the exuberant bosoms of the 15-year-old girls. Miss Marple couldn't help thinking that it all looked terribly depraved. End quote. So the idea that somehow the bosoms are bigger and more exuberant in the modern era, perhaps because of better nutrition. I also love the fact that when Miss Marple has been on her walk, she realizes that people are just people and human nature doesn't change too much. And therefore, of course, the salient point is that her deducting skills, her deducing skills, are still going to be very, very useful. But with the rise of the new development and semi-detached houses, of course, comes the decline of the country house, which we've heard of in many, many books since the war and even just before. And this is the tale of Gossington Hall, which I think we've seen mirrored over books previous, right, where old country houses have become student hostels or homes for young offenders or boys' schools or girls' schools, right? This is something that has been an ongoing concern of Agatha Christie's. Quote, Gossington Hall itself had changed hands once or twice. It had been run as a guest house, failed, and been bought by four people who had shared it as roughly four divided flats, and subsequently quarrelled. Finally, the Ministry of Health had bought it for some obscure purpose for which they eventually did not want it. The Ministry had now resold it, and it was the sale with which the two friends were discussing. So this is the sale to the film star. But I think it goes to show, doesn't it, these large country houses were sort of searching for a purpose post-war and not really finding one. And yet there's no real nostalgia for a faded path. I think Miss Marple and Dolly Bantry are admirably forward-looking. Quote, Suddenly the house felt to Mrs. Bantry old, worn out and highly artificial. In spite of its new gleaming paint, its alterations, it was, in essence, a tired old Victorian mansion. I was wise to go, thought Mrs. Bantry. Houses are like everything else. There comes a time when they've just had their day. This has had its day. It's been given a facelift, but I don't really think it's done it any good. End quote. So this is why I love Agatha Christie, a novelist who started writing in the early 1920s, now writing in the early 1960s. 40 years later, she's in her early 70s, and with her cool, calm, generous eye, she sees social change, the rise of the the suburban housing estate and, looks forward to the future. She doesn't have a fake nostalgia for the past, which I love. But how interesting to see the changes since the mysterious affair at Styles. And what is this world giving us? So, the reader who got their Christie for Christmas, what have they been experiencing since they received the Pale Horse in November 1961? In December 1961, Fidel Castro announced he was a Marxist Leninist and that Cuba will adopt socialism. America's involvement in the Vietnam War officially began too, with the first American helicopters arriving in Saigon. And in the last gasp of World War II, Adolf Eichmann was pronounced guilty of crimes against humanity by a panel of 3 Israeli judges and sentenced to death. And in decolonization news, the Portuguese surrendered Goa to India after 400 years of colonial Portuguese rule. Continuing that theme of decolonization, in January 1962, Portugal abandoned the United Nations General Assembly due to the debate over Angola, which was then a Portuguese colony. And continuing the theme of African independence, in February 1962, French President Charles de Gaulle called for Algeria to be granted independence, and the United States embargo against Cuba came into effect. And in happier technological news, while aboard Friendship 7, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. In March 1962, in pop culture news, The Incredible Hulk was first published by Marvel Comics. And the first ever Kmart discount store was opened in Garden City, Michigan. In April 1962, the Commonwealth Immigration Bill in the UK removed free immigration from the citizens of member states of the Commonwealth of Nations, which was going to become very important to my family because East African nations were about to declare independence, and it became harder for those East African Asians to come into the UK. May 1962, Dayton Hudson Corporation opens the first of its Target discount stores in Roseville, Minnesota. June 1962, Spider-Man, created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, was also introduced by Marvel Comics with the publication of Amazing Fantasy number 15. Actually, the cover date of this was August 62. In July 1962, Charles de Gaulle accepts Algerian independence. The first Walmart store opened for business in Rogers, Arkansas. What is it with all these stores opening? Amazing. Amazing time for the consumer delights that Agatha Christie reflects in the rise of the glossy supermarket. So this is really wonderful stuff. Also, the American artist Andy Warhol premieres his Campbell Soup Cans exhibition in Los Angeles. So again, this is the era of the consumer product aimed at the housewife to make her life easier. And the Rolling Stones make their debut at London's Marquee Club, opening for Long John Baldry, of all people. August 1962, the tragic death of Marilyn Monroe in Brentwood, Los Angeles. And in October 62, I guess this really is a passing of the pop cultural baton. We have the Beatles' first single in their own right, Love Me Do, double A-side with P.S. I Love You, released in the UK. And we have the film Dr. No, the first ever James Bond film release, starring Sean Connery. So, wow, the death of Marilyn Monroe, but the rise of the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, James Bond, this really is the start of the swinging 60s. But at the same time, while politics is incredibly serious, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the US and Soviet Union nearly come to blows about the installation of nuclear weapons on Cuba. And in November 1962, Alexander Solzhenitsyn publishes his novella One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is an account of his life in the Gulag. And really, the fact that it's allowed to be published, I think, is a signal that under Khrushchev, you're moving away from that Stalinist era of Soviet life and trying to acknowledge some of the misdeeds of that era. Last but not least, November 62, the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution condemning South Africa's racist apartheid policies and calls for all UN member states to impose sanctions. So my goodness, so much happening in world politics, decolonization, the rise of the Cold War, and pop culture shifting into the swinging 60s. All of which really Agatha Christie picks up upon in her novels. It's remarkable. Okay, so now let's get into the specifics of the mirror cracked from side to side and the characters. And I'm going to take them kind of in 3 groups: the people in the village, the cops, and then the people in Gossington Hall. So in the village, we of course have Miss Marple, who is now far more frail, and is kept in her house, recovering from bronchitis. She is kept amused by Mrs. Cherry Baker, who we've had mentioned just now. She's the cleaner. Miss Marple doesn't think she does a very good job, but she appreciates her, I think. And Mrs. Cherry Baker's married to Jim Baker. He does odd jobs for Miss Marple. They live on the new development. They're a bit frustrated actually with their semi detached house. It's a bit too close to the neighbours. Cherry Baker likes to play her radio, her BBC radio, very loud, and Jim Baker misses having a tool shed, so they're a little bit frustrated by suburban life. Also living in Miss Marple's house is Miss Knight, who is a carer sent to her by her nephew Raymond West, the famous author. And Miss Knight is a little bit of a domineering woman. She tends to sort of condescend to Miss Marple, and Miss Marple hatches up hilarious plans to send her out on long shopping trips for things she can't possibly buy, so that Miss Marple can abscond and go out investigating. And of course, we have Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's best friend, who used to live in Gossington Hall and first appeared in The Body in the Library. We have Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple's doctor, who first appeared in Murder at the Vicarage. We have Heather Badcock, the volunteer from the St John's Ambulance Corps that Miss Marple meets at the development, and her husband, who works in real estate. So those are the people of St Mary Mead. If we move to the cops, the chief inspector who's going to do most of the investigating is Dermot Craddock, who is a godson of Sir Henry Clithering. We've met him before in A Murder is Announced, and he does have tremendous respect for Miss Marple. He's got a sidekick, comedically called William Tiddler, and then we have a local police inspector called Frank Cornish. And then up at Gossington Hall, we have, of course, Marina Gregg, this amazingly beautiful middle-aged film star who has been married multiple times. She's now settled in England with her husband, and they're making a film which is going to be her comeback. I think we're taken to understand that she has very wide mood swings. She's incredibly sensitive to any mention of children. She tragically does not have children of her own, or children that she admits to at any rate. And she's just an absolute personality. And I think when you watch adaptations of this film, I think it really is a plum role. She is married currently to Jason Rudd, who's a film director and directing her in her film, and seems to be incredibly devoted to her. They have various staff. So there's Giuseppe, the Italian butler. There's Dr. Gilchrist, who's a private physician who lives with them permanently, because apparently the entire household seems to be taking a sort of an antidepressant called Carmo, which is a bit like Valium, I guess. And then there's Ella Zielinski, Rudd's secretary, who, a bit like all Agatha Christie secretaries, has got a pash for her boss. And then other people sort of in the orbit of Gossington Hall, we've got Gladys Dixon, who's a seamstress who works at the film studio's canteen. We've got Margot Bence, who's the portrait photographer who was hired to go to the summer fete and took pictures when the murder was happening. So obviously has important evidence of what happened that day. And we have a couple of other characters from Hollywood. So there's Ardwick Fenn, who apparently was once wildly in love with Marina Gregg, but she sort of threw him off. And there's also Lola Brewster, who's a rival American actress. Apparently was once married to one of Marina Gregg's ex-husbands and threatened to shoot her out of rivalry, but basically they're just both rather histrionic actresses. This is a quotation from the novel. I have it on very good authority, Miss Brewster, that you said, and these are your exact words, or so I'm told, he read from a notebook, that bitch needn't think she'll get away with it. If I don't shoot her now, I'll wait and get her in some other way. I don't care how long I wait, years if need be, but I'll get even with her in the end. End quote. Oh, I'm sure I never said anything of the kind, Lola laughed. I'm sure, Miss Brewster, that you did. People exaggerate so. A charming smile broke over her face. I was just mad at the moment, you know, she murmured confidentially. One says all sorts of things when one's mad with people, but you don't really think I'd wait 14 years and come across to England and look up Marina and drop some deadly poison into her cocktail glass within 3 minutes of seeing her again, end quote. And I guess that's a kind of challenge to us as the reader to ask if we do believe she'd do that. So those are the characters. In terms of how the novel reads today, I mean, it reads as an amazing social document, as I've said. There are some rather dodgy things that read a little bit regressive. There's a character called Mrs. Bain who's described as having gypsy colouring in a rather unpleasant way that we would not do today. In general, mental health issues are not described particularly sympathetically and with language that I think we would not use today, like the M word, the R word, you know, just describing people as batty or retards. I mean, we just wouldn't do that now. But I guess it would have been very typical of the time. And actually, even when I was growing up in the 1980s, so it's not that the 1960s was so bad, this is far more recent. There's also a little bit of fat shaming, just to throw in for good measure. Gladys, the seamstress, Cherry looked at her friend's fat, slightly spotty face and decided that her warnings were unnecessary. Mr. Giuseppe, she thought, would have better fish to fry elsewhere. Ugh. Okay, so let's discuss the adaptations before we get into the solution and the clues. There are actually 3 versions of this, and I watched all 3 of them before doing this podcast, which was just tremendous fun. The first, and I think arguably the most famous and the greatest, is the 1980 feature film, which has Angela Lansbury in the role of Miss Marple and has Elizabeth Taylor herself as Marina Gregg, Kim Novak as Lola Brewster, and Rock Hudson as Jinx or Jason Rudd, the husband. It's even got Tony Curtis in a small role. It's a beautifully, handsomely shot adaptation. It's incredibly good fun. I think that Kim Novak and Elizabeth Taylor are having endless fun as the rival actresses, just incredibly bitchy and nasty. It also actually has Geraldine Chaplin in a small role as the secretary. So beautifully cast, beautifully done. I think Rock Hudson is just tremendous as the husband. And the only place I would pick this up is that, Angela Lansbury's Miss Marple is by no means old and infirm. I mean, she is knocked over, but it's kind of like she's just so full of life and vitality that she's not, I think, anyone's idea of a Miss Marple. But very good, and you can watch the film on its own terms and just have a great time with it. It's also interesting that they move the setting of the novel back a decade so that the summer fete is actually a coronation fete for Queen Elizabeth II. Not really sure what that did, other than maybe even in 1980 when they were making these films, they thought they should be yet more period, I guess. The second film is part of the BBC's Joan Hickson Miss Marple series. This was the last one that was made, and it was produced and published in 1992. It stars Claire Bloom as Marina Gregg and Glynis Barber as Lola Brewster. This, for me, is the least successful of the adaptations, but it is the most faithful to the novel. So, as always, this Joan Hickson Miss Marple series is very faithful to the novels, but it just feels a little bit, as always, claustrophobic. The fun, the joy has been sucked out of it. It really, I mean, it's fine to watch, but I just wouldn't necessarily recommend it as the best of the 3. And then I think the other one that's really good is the 2010 version, which was produced by ITV, and it stars Julia Mackenzie as Miss Marple. We have Joanna Lumley, known to many as Patsy and Absolutely Fabulous, as Dolly Bantry, and she's marvellous. She's so starstruck by Marina Gregg and so sweet. Lindsay Duncan, who is an actress I admire greatly, is phenomenal as Marina Gregg. She captures that aging but still amazingly elegant beauty, the tragedy of her life. It's a beautiful performance. And for Ted Lasso fans, you get a very early sighting of Hannah Waddingham as Lola Brewster. So that's one to watch. And for Downton Abbey fans, you get Hugh Bonneville as the police officer. So there's all sorts of fun to be had with that. It's broadly faithful to the novel. I mean, both, well, maybe all of the adaptations really trim down the development and all the social change, and a lot of them take away some of the minor characters who turn out to be red herrings to focus on the rivalry between Lola Brewster and Marina Gregg, because that's where the fun is for the actresses in particular. And I think all of them struggle a little bit because they're itching to have Miss Marple be more active, which is completely at odds with the frail and old Miss Marple of the books. Okay, folks, so I'll leave it there with a spoiler-free section. Join us next time for The Clocks, an Hercule Poirot mystery that was published in 1963 when Agatha Christie was 73. Just phenomenal, really. And join us after the end credits music for the solutions and the clues. Welcome back, everyone. So, basically, the solution to this novel is given to you between pages 20 and 25. I think it's incredibly easy to deduce what happened in this book. What happened was Heather Badcock went to see Marina Gregg when she was very sick with German measles. Her husband himself says it was selfish. Then Mrs. Bantry says Marina longed for a child, finally had one, but it was severely sick, after which she had a nervous breakdown and stopped acting. So you realise and put together the fact that Heather Badcock was ill, gave German measles to Marina, and therefore Marina's child was born severely mentally compromised. But we also know from having read lots of Miss Marple that whenever there's an actress, you have to be on your guard, and Marina Gregg is actress Claxon, an actress. So what happened is as Heather Badcock tells her this tale of putting on makeup and getting herself out of bed, her sick bed, and going to see Marina Gregg, so proud of herself for sort of not letting sickness get her down, Marina Gregg's eye glances towards a portrait on the stairway of this country house, which is a virgin and child, so a Madonna and baby, and suddenly puts two and two together in a flash and realizes this is the woman who gave her German measles and denied her chance at motherhood. She gets that mirror cracked Lady of Shalott, the curse has come upon me look that everyone remarks upon. She very quickly snaps back out of it and decides spontaneously she's going to kill Heather Badcock. So she gets her Calmo, she puts some grains into the daiquiri that is her own, deliberately nudges Heather Badcock to spill Heather Badcock's cocktail all over Heather's dress, and then very kindly offers Heather, oh, have my daiquiri instead, I've already had too many. And Heather just drinks it down and dies because she's been overdosed with Calmo. But of course, Marina's very paranoid that someone's seen her put the Calmo in the drink, so she decides to give a performance that she is being persecuted and that she is receiving death threats through the mail on letter form, and to try and make it look like the daiquiri was indeed intended for her and she's the real victim, which everyone at first believes. But this is, of course, just a canard, and her husband Jason realizes this because he knows that if in real life, if Marina had received those threatening letters, she would have immediately told him. She's so high amplitude in her reactions. So he tries to cover up for her. Meanwhile, we learn that one of Marina's adopted children turns out to be the photographer Margot Bentz. That's a red herring. We also realize, and this is the most stupid part of the plot, totally unnecessary and really absurd, that Heather Badcock's husband was in fact Marina Gregg's first husband, who she didn't even recognize. Shades of Murder in Mesopotamia. It's so absurd, and in two of the three adaptations that is taken out, and I'm very pleased it is because I think it's a real weakness of the novel. And so what happens is that the secretary is trying to blackmail people. Well, she's not really trying to blackmail people. She's kind of ringing them up, hoping one of them will confess if she says, you were seen, meet me at such and such place. But because she does that, Marina Gregg puts poison in her atomizer, her anti-asthma atomizer, and kills her that way. And the third murder is that Marina ends up shooting Giuseppe the butler, who is murdering her because Gladys has realized that Marina knocked the drink deliberately. Just put two and two together, so she shoots him. So those are three murders already. And then the fourth murder is that Jason Rudd realizes that there's no way she's going to evade the police on this, and he gives her Carmo and poisons her overnight in her sleep. And we never know if he's prosecuted. It's left very ambiguous. Now, in two, I think, of the three adaptations, you're led to believe that Miss Marple lets him off and tells the police that it must have been suicide. But actually, as with Ordeal by Innocence, this is a much more ambiguous ending, and I love the way it's written in that way. So I think it's a very well put together murder. It's very well clued. I think the problem is you can tell who did it and why very soon, because the stuff about motherhood and the Madonna and child and Heather Badcock just being very unself-aware and very selfish, it's laid on pretty thick. So I think you can deduce this one. The only flaw in the plotting of the novel, I think, is the unnecessary addition of the first husband. So here's a little point of history. Apparently, Agatha Christie was influenced by the life of the real American actress Jean Tierney. Apparently, Jean Tierney did contract German measles while pregnant with her first child in June 43, and that child was institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital. And then apparently a year after the birth, Jean Tierney did meet the woman who had skipped quarantine in order to meet her idol when she had German measles. So there we are. Apparently this really happened. Incredibly moving story. And I think moving not just because of what this frenzy toward motherhood has done to Marina Gregg, but also I think the character of Jason Rudd. And I think when you look at the adaptations, it's often the actor playing that character who has, I think, some of the most moving scenes towards the end. Really tremendous. So I love the novel for that. I love it for its amazing depiction of social change. Like I said, that the plotting, there are one or two things I don't like about the plotting. The other thing I don't like is this obsession that Agatha Christie has with adopting children going wrong and being cruel, that the mothers shouldn't give up these children and that the adoptive mothers sort of buy them and fake motherhood. And I know this is heavily influenced by Agatha Christie's impression of what happened to her own mother and that adoption wasn't the right choice there. But I think it's really unfair on all the amazing adoptive parents out there and all the times it goes so well. She seems to really have a blind spot and a prejudice about adoption. So it always makes me feel very queasy when I read those parts. Anyways, I hope you enjoy The Mirror Cracked. I know it never scores highly when people rank these novels, but I think it has so much to offer beyond conventional murder mystery. It's a wonderful documentary evidence of Britain in 1962, and I think it's really well worth a read. Anyways, thank you for listening. If you have any comments, feel free to jump on the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord server or leave a comment on the YouTube channel. Thank you for listening.